Subscribe to get more stories like this, fresh tales delivered straight to your inbox. They say no thief ever swears his hand is crooked. The same could be said. The town liked to joke about certain widows who swore their grips were for protection and not possession. Margaret Hale swept into Charles Mercer's office like a storm that had learned the manners of silk. Her gloves left pale crescents on his desk. Her boots announced each step with the punctuation of authority. The little meat and iron office smelled of coffee and saddle oil. The late sun struck the dust motes and turned them into a slow, approving audience. Charles tipped his hat just enough to reveal a grin that softened the hard planes of his face. Folks called him a rancher, and that was true. He could make a colt obey with a look. But he carried the patient intelligence of a man who read law books for pleasure. He watched Margaret with kindly interest, sipping his coffee as though time itself were a luxury he could afford. "I ain't here for myself," she said, placing both gloved hands on his desk, the knucklebones white beneath the leather. "I'm here to save my boy from ruin." He folded his hands in his lap and listened. He had learned long ago that listening was a kind of kindness. It made people tell you their secrets in neat sentences. Margaret's voice cracked like a whip as she rattled through the parade of wrong-sorted women who had, in her view, nearly wrecked her son. The first one acted like she was a lady of the city, didn't know how to curtsy or show proper respect. The second put notions in his head, talks too big about books and far-off places. And the last, she snapped. "Lord help me," she picks his shirts and tells him which stew to eat. Her chest heaved. They treat him like a hired hand. Charles let the comment hang. Outside, someone dropped a sack of feed, and the sound boomed, an unkind echo that made Margaret jump and then scowl at the ground as if it had betrayed her. "If you're the man people say settles things," she finished, "then by thunder, settle this before my son ruins his life." Charles watched her pace. She was probably in her mid-40s, hair the soft gray of steel wool, eyes that could saw a fence post in half, silk that had known better parlors than Calhoun Crossing. Her money was the sort that could speak on its own. The ranch she'd inherited climbed the hills in a way that made it obvious it had been bought with hard work and shrewdness. She had kept the place intact after her husband's death, and she kept her son, Daniel Hale, near enough that people wondered which of them owned the place and which of them belonged to whom. "Tell me about the first one," Charles said when she paused long enough to take a breath. "Claire Benson," Margaret said, "banker's daughter from Silver Creek. Pretty face, but she carried herself like a man, offhand, brisk. She asked to bring a book to my tea of all things, said she liked to read about women's rights. Imagine my boy courting someone who thinks she should vote. I mentioned it to her father. Banker Benson saw sense." Charles's eyebrow lifted. "You went to her father." "A mother does what she must," Margaret said with a hard little smile. "I talked plain about influences. No one wants trouble near their children." Charles put his cup down lightly and made no comment. That quiet made her talk faster, spilling the list of offenses. Claire's independence. Lydia Monroe's corrections at a dinner party that made Margaret feel small. Grace Porter, who began slowly and then with the confidence of someone used to being useful, rearranging the Hale parlor and nudging Daniel to hire her brother on the ranch. "You got her fired?" Charles said finally, not accusing so much as stating a fact. "I spoke to the board," Margaret said sharply. "I said the school needs teachers who honor their elders. The board acted. You ride past fences and make notes about paint. You interrogate neighbors. That's a lot of time spent on someone else's business." "It's my son," she snapped. "I've been his mother since he was born. I know him. What makes him laugh, what keeps him up at night. I won't let some interloper come here and take that away." Charles watched her, the light catching the lines around his mouth. When he spoke, his voice was as steady as a trail through the pines. "Mrs. Hale, perhaps it isn't that you hate these women. Maybe you hate losing the boy who needed you." Her head snapped up. "How dare you suggest?" "It's not a suggestion," he said calmly. "It's an observation. I've seen it before." He leaned forward and, with a kind of mischief that made his voice velvet, invented a diagnosis in the tone of a joke one tells in bad lighting. "Stage 4, Mothers in Love Syndrome, Mills." Starts with extra interest in a son's courting, escalates to surveillance, ends with sabotage. I prescribe abstinence. Margaret blinked, eyes wide with outrage that carefully braided with the hint of shame. You are speaking nonsense. Maybe, Charles said. Or maybe you're someone who needs to let a man live his own life. You trust Daniel to handle cattle and ledgers, thousands of dollars, hundreds of animals, yet you won't trust his heart to him? She bristled. Women are complicated. So are men, Charles said gently, and sometimes mothers see danger where there's only differentness. Claire may have been ambitious, Lydia may have been clever, Grace may have wanted to help. You convinced yourself each was a threat because you feared being replaced. The words landed with the weight of a stone thrown into a still pond. Margaret's fingers curled into each other at her side. She had spent 3 years, the 3 years after her husband's death, tucking her life into the margin where a mother belonged, where her son's needs filled the spaces her husband had left. She had found purpose in protecting him. She had let the world shrink to the size of his irregular breaths. What's the cure then? She demanded, more angry than curious. Charles smiled in a way that suggested he had been waiting for the question. He grabbed a pencil and made a mock inventory on a scrap of paper. Abstinence from meddling, acceptance that your son is his own man, and, this one's the trickiest, find someone for yourself. She laughed, brittle and high, that laugh that sounded like glass catching a small stone. Find someone? At my age? Unseemly. People would talk. I'd be accused of forgetting my husband's memory. People already talk about your son's folly, Charles said. You can either let them talk about your worry or talk about your happiness. Margaret's chest tightened. He had read deeper than she wanted. The stitch that had been there since the funeral, fear of loneliness, the outrage at being expected to let go, opened like a bruise. I loved my husband, she said softly. I still do. You don't know what it's like to lose what keeps you steady. He did know. His jaw brightened, and his eyes for a moment were not amused. I lost mine, he said. Childbirth took them. 7 years back. The first months were a kind of bleakness you can't describe. Then, one learns to let what's left teach them how to live. She had not expected confession, and it softened her. For a minute, the room held 2 people who had both been wrecked and had both made, from their broken pieces, lives that looked like solidity. Charles's mock diagnosis had been the wedge, his confession, the key. If I'm ill, she said finally, voice muddled, what happens if I refuse your treatment? He told her in those simple rural sentences that she could grow her fear into possession, and she might lose her son to resentment and distance. Or she could step back and let him find his own happiness, and perhaps find a pulse of life of her own that was not only caretaker, but companion. She left his office with lavender still clinging to her from the handkerchief she had tucked into her sleeve, feeling both affronted and oddly light. For the first time in a long while, she walked home, wondering if there was more than the narrow script she'd recited for years. 3 weeks later, a telegram arrived that made the paper in her hands soft from rereading. Daniel had married. Not one of the women Margaret had scoped and judged, one she had not seen coming. Emma Lawson, a shopkeeper's daughter from 3 towns over, known in passing for pie judging and a steady hand. Daniel had courted and married in secret. She had been left on the porch of propriety while her son moved on without her benediction. He came in like a storm, dust on his boots and heat in his face. We need to talk, he said, his voice taut as wire. They spoke with a strange honesty that cut away the rhetoric she'd built for herself. Daniel did not come to the house demanding her apology. He knelt and took her hands and looked at her like a man who had been learning to live with new truths. You drove them away, he said simply, and it was not only accusation but heartbreak. Claire, Lydia, Grace, each time you made a decision for me rather than with me. I loved them, yes, I loved you. I couldn't stand to watch you make me into someone who could not choose for himself. She tasted something sour. I thought you would be grateful. You thought you were saving me, he answered. You were saving yourself from being alone. The confession landed between them, soft and terrible. He told her about the county fair. The pie contest where Emma had been a stern, fair judge, where Daniel had admired her honesty. He told her about how he'd been too afraid to wait for Margaret's approval. He had been afraid she would play guardian again, and he would lose another chance. He had loved the patience in Emma's hands, the way she appreciated things built with care. "You married without telling me," Margaret whispered. "I couldn't risk losing her because I waited on your approval," he said. "I love you, Ma, always, but I needed to be the man I meant to be Daniel, not your small boy." She heard himself in that and the truth. Her grief had been carving a little room for itself around him until there was no space left for anything else. For the first time she imagined her son as a man with a separate hearth, and it made an ache through her bones, but also a hollow where something new might take root. "Are you happy?" she asked, and already knew the answer when his face lit. "Happier than I have any right to be," he said. He didn't demand her blessing. He asked her to be willing to let him love well. He asked her, in time, to make room. It was then that the town's gossip had its feast, and Charles Mercer's name threaded through it, because he had been seen more and more in Margaret's company after that day. Simple visits that became walks, walks that became dinners, dinners that became a revealing of the small, necessary tendernesses two people in their middle years could offer each other. He brought her books she'd never read, authors who wrote about things beyond cattle drives and town meetings. He made her ride across his land until she laughed at the dirt in her gloves. He teased and respected in equal measure, and slowly Margaret found the stiffness around her heart give way to a warmth that surprised her. She had never thought herself the sort to remarry. The 3 years of black and stoicism had been as much a promise to her late husband as a wall she had built to keep the world at a measured distance. Now, the wall required a new mortar. Charles's patience with her defenses was a kind of gentle siege. One afternoon the telegram came that made her stomach flutter with something like dread and delight. Daniel had arrived home with his wife. Margaret smoothed her skirts and prepared as though for battle. But when Emma extended her hand, steady, warm, and without a hint of tremor, Margaret felt something like gratitude. Emma was nothing like the caricatures Margaret had feared. She had a practical laugh and the kind of clear eyes that read situations without the need to dominate them. When she complimented Margaret on the arrangement of the parlor and then teased her about the salt in Mrs. Green's pie, Margaret felt the stubborn wall inside her shift. Emma wanted to learn, and she wanted to be part of a life, not to rearrange it into someone else's image. It should have been simple, but family tension is a shadow that loves corners. Daniel wanted a private word with his mother, and they stood in the quiet of the parlor while laughter and china clinked from the kitchen. The conversation that followed was sharp, words like knives over a long-kept bruise. Daniel accused. Margaret defended. Charles stepped back, a steady presence by the door. "You cannot have it both ways," Daniel said finally, something like exhausted pleading in his tone. "You want me to marry for love, but you cannot support that when it's my turn to choose. You say you trust me with business, but not with my life." The argument, as these things go, peeled away layers of resentment and showed raw nerves that had never been acknowledged. Margaret found that she could argue back, not to win, but to claim her own right to be more than a mother. She told Daniel that after 3 years of mourning she had begun to remember that she could want, too. If he could ask for his happiness, she would ask for hers. He accused. She stepped forward. Lines were drawn and then softened by some small stubborn grace. Emma took Daniel's hand. Charles took Margaret's. And the family found that the new arrangement, awkward at first, could work. 6 months later the town watched with its usual delight as Margaret and Charles married. The widow in cream silk, not white but luminous nonetheless. The rancher, hatless and smiling, clearly amused at the idea of officiating his own kind of medicine. The preacher joked about diagnoses and cures, and the congregation clapped as the unlikely pair sealed vows with laughter that sounded somehow younger than either of them felt inside. People had predicted scandal. They got a party. Margaret's smile had grown into something honest. She danced with a freedom she had not known in years, and Daniel, sitting with his wife in the front pew, watched with a complicated expression, relief, pride, and the faint tear line of forgiveness. Life settled into a new rhythm. Emma's competence in the store and her knack for solving practical problems brought improvements to the ranch. she learned to ride, and Daniel learned that love could be a quiet sort of partnership, rather than a parade of dramatic rescues. Margaret and Charles found that sharing a life was not surrender, but an enlargement of both their worlds. Margaret taught Charles what the town council needed and how to read the books she'd always kept to herself. Charles taught Margaret where to find stubborn joy, how to laugh when the geese ruined the garden, how to keep a temper where it belonged. They laughed about the diagnosis. Charles joked about making a pamphlet, and Daniel, somewhat reluctantly amused, suggested the market might buy a Rancher's Guide to Peculiar Syndromes. The joke found a publisher of sorts in the way gossip travels. Someone stuck a humorous pamphlet in the county newspaper and people read it and laughed at the idea of invented illnesses that sounded suspiciously like truths. Margaret, who had once shriveled from attention, found herself warming to the idea of being known not only as Daniel's mother, but as someone who had a life beyond worry and watchfulness. Then there was a small miracle. 2 months after their wedding, a baby came into the world, and the house that had once echoed with the hollow spaces of memory filled with the soft, exacting sound of a newborn's cry. Margaret held him with trembling reverence. Charles paced like a man learning to watch a new kind of flock. Daniel and Emma stood like carved partners, eyes shining. They named him Henry, and at the crib she felt something that had been missing for too long. The sense that love could be given freely, not as insurance against loneliness, but as a practice of generosity. She promised, in a whisper that belonged to the middle of the night, that this child would be allowed to love and fail and learn, unshadowed by her earlier fears. Years slide by with a pleasant speed. The ranch prospered under the combined energies of experience and innovation. Daniel and Emma had daughters, Lucy and Nora, who toddled about the yard with apples in their fists and giggles as bright as bells. Margaret sat in a lawn chair and mended shirts, one eye on the children and the other on her husband as he taught Henry to throw a rope. She found herself teasing Daniel for his fussiness and Charles for his tendency to tinker with everything. Her domain had widened in a way that resembled healing rather than fixing. She was not cured of longing, but she had learned to carry it without making it a harness for others. One evening, with the sun fat and slow, the family gathered on the porch. Mail arrived, an unsolicited letter to Charles from a publisher who, amused by the pamphlet and the ripple of stories about the so-called Mills cure, thought maybe there was a book in the humor of rural diagnoses. Charles, who had never sought attention past his land, laughed until he had tears. "A book," he said. "Who'd read such nonsense?" "You'd be surprised," Margaret said. "Maybe some will read it and realize there's truth under the jokes." They sat back and watched Lucy chase an old dog that had been more clever than most in avoiding the noose of a child's imagination. Nora had a piece of string and a world of plans. Henry, at 5, tried earnestly to loop the rope like his father, and Margaret's heart felt the same softening as a field after rain. Subscribe now to follow more stories of second chances, small towns, and stubborn hearts. It wasn't all unbroken happiness. Sometimes old habits returned like winter shadows. Margaret could still flare when she thought someone had been slighted. Charles had his old griefs. Daniel had days when being both a son and a husband felt like a tightrope. But when arguments rose, they fell back into the habit of speaking, not to control, but to be understood. Laughter was the salve they reached for most often, the shared remedy for what could not be fixed with a ledger or a rule of etiquette. On a night punctured with stars, Margaret found herself tucking a small blanket around Henry and catching her breath with a gratitude that was both wild and serene. The life she had feared losing had not disappeared but expanded. Love had not been divided, it had multiplied to fit the needs of new people and new mornings. Charles kissed her forehead and muttered the same diagnosis he had joked about years before. "Mrs. Hale," he said in mock solemnity, "I prescribe daily doses of nonsense, weekly service of being desired, and yearly examinations of why we ever feared letting go." She laughed, a clear bell now, and accepted the prescription. "Best doctor I ever had," she said, though argumentative. "You were thorough," he said, soft. "You were strong." "Can we be both?" she asked. "We can be both," he promised, And the promise was kept in the small things, in the way he folded the shirts on the chair, in the way she let him bring her coffee in the mornings, in the way they stood together by the fence when storms came and watched the cattle cluster like a single living thing not broken by weather. Years later, when folks in town still talked about that widow who had meddled and then married, and when children asked, as children do, whether their parents ever made mistakes, Margaret would tell them this: loving someone does not mean owning them. Love, properly wielded, is the courage to let go when it's time and the bravery to take a hand when it's offered. She would hold up a small, wrinkled piece of paper, the telegram announcing Daniel's first arrival home with Emma, and say with that sly smile she had learned to wear, "That was the start of my education." If you like this tale and want more, subscribe for the next one. More twists, stranger cures, and stubborn hearts waiting to be healed.